Hello again from Green Island, and thank you for joining us once again for the second instalment in our garden design series of videos. The previous video we looked at the positive attributes of plants and how you should always put plants in your garden that have at least 3 or 4 positive attributes in order to get your garden to look good all year round. On the flip side of that, there's some plants that have what I would call negative attributes, and those should be avoided. So today we're going to look at some of those. So the number one negative attribute, I would say, is something that's toxic. Now, a lot of plants have toxic properties about them, and people can get a bit obsessed about not planting anything that might produce something that's toxic. But in reality, a lot of the things are toxic only to birds or certain animals. But for me, something that might cause a problem, realistically, something like a euphorbia. They're beautiful plants and they've got lots and lots of positive attributes, but just really beware, because when you touch them, you should only do it with gloves, they give off this milky white sap, and if you cut a stem, for example, you can see immediately how it bleeds milky white sap, and that is really, really irritant to the skin. And if you get it onto your bare skin, it will actually burn and blister and scar really quite badly. So if you really like euphorbias, I would say still plant them because they have lots of positive attributes, but just beware. If ever you're working with them, A, wear gloves, as I'm not doing today, and B, make sure that you don't prune them or deadhead them when it's a hot sunny day, because if you do, your pores on your skin are open, and even if you just drop a tiny bit of that milky sap onto your leg, it will burn and scar. So number 2 on the negative attributes list is something that can become invasive. Now, there's lots of plants that can become invasive in certain conditions but might grow perfectly well here. For example, Nandina domestica, the sacred bamboo, wonderful plant, very well behaved over here, but apparently in America it can become a problem in some places. Same with Paulownia, a foxglove tree. But here in the British Isles, there's certain plants, Rhododendron ponticum, the common purple flowered rhododendron, that it is actually a crime to plant now in places. It's taking over huge swathes of woodland. It also really only has one attribute. Well, it is evergreen and very short flowering period, so I wouldn't plant it anyway. But other plants on a smaller scale, such as this little lamium we've got here, it's a really pretty little relative of the dead nettle. It has lovely spires of yellow flowers, but it can become very invasive and take over a large area. So I would say when you're shopping and looking for plants, if something says good ground cover on the label, do a little bit of research, because often that should actually read can become a menace or can become invasive. Number 3 on the list of negative attributes is something that's prone to pests and diseases. Something, for example, like lilies. These are enormous tree lilies, which we grow here at Green Island, and they are absolutely magnificent in the summer, with up to 40 blooms per head on some of them. But like all lilies, they are prone to the dreaded lily beetle. These little red beetles, which appear usually at the end of April, May time, and their eggs hatch into larvae which look like grey slime on the leaves, and they can almost defoliate the leaves on the lilies overnight, completely decimate a whole crop of them, which is a terrible shame. But having said that, the plus points that the lilies provide with their long flowering period and the beautiful scent which they waft over a large area of the garden, their fantastic cut flower, their bulbs, so you can see they have lots of plus points. So the one negative of the lily beetles for me is outweighed. Another problem we have, slugs and snails, and in fact these are the pests and disease that the RHS are most commonly asked about by their members. Hostas are absolutely decimated by slugs and snails. Fortunately here we have a large population of frogs and toads, so they tend to keep on top of them. Also lots of birds, and by having water and encouraging wildlife, we do tend to manage the population of slugs and snails that way. The other thing I have found with hostas is that the slugs and snails seem to prefer some varieties to others. They're more to their taste. And there's one particular variety where I just allow a patch to grow, and the slugs and snails have an absolute feast on them. And I think, well, fair enough, if they leave all my other hostas alone in the garden, that's fine. I'm doing my bit for the wildlife. Number 4 is something that requires high maintenance. And into that category go most of the old traditional herbaceous perennials, such as delphiniums, lupins, Michaelmas daisies. If you think about their life cycle, you need to clear away the rubbish in the spring, you need to stake them whilst they're growing. Often they're prone to slugs and snails, so you've got to be vigilant for those. And they have a very short flowering period, and then usually after they've flowered, every 3 to 5 years, you need to lift the clump up, split it, divide it, discard the middle bit and replant. So here we've just got an example. These are Michaelmas daisies, asters, now called Symphia trichon. This is a particularly lovely one called Andenkanen and Alma Pochka. And you can see already the supports in place for these when they start growing up. We're fortunate that we do have a large enough garden that we have space to allow a few plants with only 1 or 2 positive attributes. But if you've got a really small garden, the more important it is that each plant is going to tick lots of boxes and not have too many negatives beside it. So in a small garden, I would say do away with all the old traditional herbaceous perennials. Number 5 is something with a short flowering period. So remember, we're trying to get colour all through the year. So if you've got something that's planted purely for its flowers, such as this lovely tree peony, beautiful though it is, they sadly flower for only 1 to 2 weeks probably in the year. So if you think of that, 2 weeks of colour for 52 weeks of not so much colour. So instead of something like this, even if you do absolutely love peonies, try and choose a variety that's going to give you something else other than the beauty of the flowers. So instead of the traditional herbaceous peonies, which flower for a very short time, or the tree peonies we just looked at, I would recommend, if you really love peonies, try this one. This is a species peony. It's called Peony mascula, and it emerges with the most beautiful, deep, vibrant wine red foliage in March time. Absolutely gorgeous. And then the leaves develop and open up. They colour to a green colour, but we've still got the lovely red stems. And then in a week or 2, it's going to be absolutely covered with these beautiful bright pink blooms. And then the foliage remains beautiful all summer, a nice clump of it. And then the added bonus is the most beautiful seed heads when they open in the autumn, revealing these lovely bright pink berries. So lots of interest throughout the year with that one. Number 6 of my negative attributes is something which is a greedy feeder. And the classic one of those is the dreaded Leylandii conifers. So many times people come to me and say, oh, next door I've got a Leylandii conifer hedge and I can't grow anything my side of the fence because it just starves the soil. Similar are fritillaries. This one is a beautiful one, Persica adiaman it's called, but it is a greedy feeder. In order to flower well, it does need to be fed after it's flowered each year. So we just use some well-rotted manure, horse manure, and that seems to promote flowering. But if you don't do that, you get this sort of phenomenon where a lot of the stems just come up without any flowers, and so that's what we call their flowering blind. So they produce no flowers. For me, the foliage and the flowers are beautiful, and the negatives do outweigh the positives, and I have got the means to be able to feed them. But again, if you've got a small garden and you want low maintenance, it's something that I would think twice about planting. Number 7 is any plant that has only one attribute. And into this category will fall a lot of evergreens that people plant, often for hedging. So something like a yew or privet or laurel, this common laurel here, huge leaves. It doesn't even make a very good hedge because when you prune it, the leaves are cut. You're much better to use something with smaller leaves so you don't get the unsightly cuts on it. But this laurel can actually be a real thug and a nuisance. So I would recommend, if you want to grow something for a hedge and you want it evergreen, choose something else that has something in addition, like Photinia fraserii red robin, for example, that we looked at in the previous video. there's all sorts of examples of alternatives to use. Another classic is the forsythia, flowering shrub in the spring with bright yellow flowers. Lots of people come to me and say, oh, but I love my forsythia, it's lovely and yellow and bright in the spring. It is, but only for a week or two. The rest of the year it makes the most scruffy, untidy, unsightly shrub and really gives nothing to the structure and the overall appearance of the garden. For those that absolutely love their forsythias and I can't persuade them to part with them, I would suggest why not try Ibeliophilum disticum. Now this is a lovely plant. Its common name is white forsythia, and you can see from the flowers that they are very similar. However, it flowers for a much longer period. It has these beautifully scented flowers, sweet scent which is emitted from the flowers, and if you cut them and bring them indoors it will last for well over a week. It can also be trained as a wall shrub, which is another plus point, another bonus for it, which means it doesn't have to take up too much space in the garden. So I definitely suggest trying this one instead of the traditional yellow forsythia. And if it's the yellow that you really like, then try Cornus mas, the lovely spring flowering shrub with yellow flowers that produces red berries later in the year. Now some of these plants may tick lots of positive boxes, but also have a couple of negative attributes. So with those, I would say weigh up the positives against the negatives. For example, the lilies might have 2 or 3 positive attributes, but they are prone to lily beetle. But on balance, they're still going to be left with a positive number, maybe only 2. But you can gauge from the size of your garden whether it then merits space in it. Number 8 is plants that have an unpleasant smell. There's a lot of plants that we put in the garden because they have a beautiful smell, either their flowers or their leaves. But unfortunately there's a few that produce the most horrible smell, and the one that comes to mind immediately is called Dracunculus vulgaris. This is an aroid, so it produces an enormous spathe, maroon in colour in the summer, and has exotic tropical looking leaves. But the unfortunate thing is that it's pollinated by flies, so in order to attract pollinators to it, it gives off the horrible, horrible smell of rotting flesh, which the flies absolutely love. So for the first few days when the spathe opens, all you can smell is rotting flesh in the vicinity. So I would say if you do like the plant it where it's not too near to the path or not too near to the house where you're going to be subjected to the smell. But fortunately, as soon as the plant's been pollinated and the flies have done their work, it stops producing the smell. So you can usually enjoy the spathes for another couple of weeks after that. For number 9, which is plants that might not be fully hardy, I've come into the greenhouse because the salvias and things that we do grow that are not fully hardy, we have to take cuttings from them, we have to dig them up, some of them, and bring them in and just keep a certain amount of stock plants in case we have a really, really cold winter like we've just experienced. So you can see various stages here. This is a stock plant, this is one, this is pink amistad, and we've got straight amistad here. Amistad is generally hardy for us, but nevertheless I'll still take a few cuttings and things. This little tray is cuttings that are taken as insurance, and another one over here. So we've got various stock plants of these, but it does mean quite a lot of work. But salvias are fantastic for their autumn colour. They're beautifully scented leaves and foliage, and also they flower for a really, really long time. So they've got lots of plus points, but if you haven't got the means to propagate and save some stock plants over the winter, then I would definitely think twice about growing salvias. And if you do want to grow salvias, try and choose some of the more hardy varieties. So amistad is usually fully hardy for us in Green Island. Hot lips, some of the smaller flowered, smaller leaf varieties, microphylla, hot lips for example. The bigger leaves and the more exotic blooms tend to be slightly less hardy, so I would avoid those ones. Finally, number 10 of the negative attributes is anything that is an annual or a biennial, because again that needs a lot of maintenance. It's very expensive and they flower for a really short period of time. They need a lot of watering and deadheading to make them continue to flower, and then you're left with nothing through the winter. The only annuals and biennials that we tend to grow here at Green Island are those that seed themselves around, and even those can become a bit of a menace. This little one, for example, Papaver somniferum, is very lovely, very easy to grow, and we do allow them to just seed around and pop up where they feel like it, and any that are surplus to requirements we just pull out when we don't need them. This is another annual that we actually allow to seed itself around at Green Island, and it's called Orlaya grandiflora. It has this lovely ferny foliage and then sprays of beautiful small white flowers through the summer. Again, it can become a little bit rampant in certain areas, but it's very easy just to pull out extra ones. As I say, we never go through the process of growing from seed, pricking out, potting on, planting out. It would just be far too much work. And structurally, most annual plants do not give anything in terms of their foliage or the structure of the plant to add to the overall structure and makeup of the garden. Thank you for watching once again. Please remember to subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to be alerted when the next design video comes out.